To those of us who are still here at the Hartwell Theatre, having a wonderful time, those of you who are joining us online, be reminded, for those who did not yet know, that you can view the symposium via YouTube, courtesy of CIG TV. And so now we're going to go into a performance, and then I will come back to very briefly introduce our final panel of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and help me welcome on stage a performance by the Cayman Islands National Folk Singers. They are a company of amateur singers and musicians dedicated primarily to preserving, celebrating, and propagating the musical traditions of the Cayman Islands. They are very appropriately here joining us today, and we're happy to welcome them on stage. Let's put our hands together as they come.
Chip up potato, chip up potato, chip up potato. I don't want no chip up potato, give me my dumpling home. I don't want no chip up potato, chip up potato, chip up potato. I don't want no chip up potato, give me my dumpling home.
I don't want no grilling cassava, grilling cassava, grilling cassava. I don't want no grilling cassava, give me my dumpling home.
I don't want no chip up potato, chip up potato, chip up potato. I don't want no chip up potato. Give me my dumpling home.
I don't want no grilling banana, grilling banana.
sound, boy, Muncie Booty the sound. When you talking about blue spot head all around. Lambert said to Bertie,
Why, give me a soldier head.
Bertie said to Lambert,
Why, on the squad is dead.
Muncie Booty the sound, boy, Muncie Booty the sound. When you talking about blue spot head all around. Muncie Booty the sound, boy, Muncie Booty the sound. When you talking about blue spot head all around.
Who doesn't like a bit of entertainment? Let's put our hands together one more time for the Cayman Islands National Folk Singers. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce our final panel of the day. I'm going to be calling them on stage, telling you a little bit about them. And as you know, as long as I have introduced them this one time, they will come up in the order in which they are introduced to do their various presentations. So the final panel is comprised of Miss Shannon Seymour, a psychologist with over 25 years of clinical experience, the director of the Wellness Center, and co-founder of the Cayman Islands Psychological Association. Her topic is understanding early childhood risk factors associated with the historical trauma of slavery amongst modern Afro-Caribbean family systems. She will be followed by Miss Linda Clark, an accountant by profession and the scientific coordinator for Plastic Free Cayman. She'll be speaking on the topic adaptive governance, the proposed port expansion in the Cayman Islands, and its impact on coral reefs, Roy Bodden's activism. Our third speaker will be Mr. George Jackman, educator, dairy farmer, and teacher unionist, sometimes solely, sometimes simultaneously. His topic, Caribbean Farms Limited, Cayman's commercial dairy, Sir Anthony Fisher's failed initiative. And our final speaker for the day, well, on this panel, he's replacing who you're seeing on your program. Our final speaker is going to be Mr. Hadley Roberts, who is a paralegal and linguist and was recently the head of mission of the local election observer team. His topic is General Election 2021, Lessons from the Domestic Observers Report. Could you put our hands together for all of our panelists as I invite Ms. Shannon Seymour to come. A quick reminder, if I will, that each presenter has 20 minutes. We will ring the bell at the 15-minute mark, indicating that 5 minutes are remaining, and we're asking that our panelists stick to the time as closely as possible. Thank you.
I'm going to do my best. Good afternoon, everybody. To the Cayman National Cultural Foundation and Roy Bodden, thank you for an invitation to present at this very important event. I'm really excited to be here today as part of this discussion because I believe that psychology has a really important role in understanding and exploring any society, and in particular, Caymanian society. This paper that I'm going to present was actually written in 2019 as part of the literature review for my ongoing doctorate dissertation that's looking at the role of infant mental health, racism and slavery, and parental attachment. I should have been done by now, but COVID had another plan for me in 2020. So what is infant mental health? I get asked this all the time. People say, babies don't get depression. What's this about? Infant mental health is not infant mental illness. Infant mental health is the study of the relationship between the caregiver and the young child from the context of a social environment and through the lens of neurology and brain development. So it's understanding the role of attachment, how that is impacted by society or environment, and how that collectively impacts the development of a young child's brain. And given our current concerns for education and our current concerns for mental health care, I think that it's a topic that is very important and one that can lend a great deal of opportunity for learning. One of the critical aspects of infant mental health is the cultural context. It places a high value on understanding not only the relationship between the caregiver and the infant or child, but the relationship that that unit has within the society that it exists. And as an 18-year-old who moved to the Cayman Islands in 1988, I had what I think is an advantageous opportunity to be immersed into Cayman culture that expats may not have today. Within a very short period of time, I was drumming with Aunt Julia at Miss Rena's preschool. I was on stage with Suki and Ezekiel, and I was being interviewed by Claude Bailey at the Annex watching football matches. And so I feel very fortunate to have come here 32 years ago at a time when becoming immersed in Cayman culture was your only option. So just briefly, the pioneers of infant mental health are often considered many of the pioneers of the study in the field of psychology in general. So we have Bowlby in 1958, and anybody that's taken a Psych 100 class would have learned about attachment theories, and this was sort of revolutionary back at the time, but it really was that idea that babies needed more than just food and clothing and shelter. They actually needed warmth and responsive caregiving and love and nurturing to be able to thrive and grow. We see next the work of Selma Freiberg, who was really pivotal in the development of the infant mental health field. She saw the relationship between a mother's own mental health and that of her child's development as critical, and she was one of the first in the field of psychology that looked at treating the mother and the infant collectively as a unit. A lot of times today, even in mental health, we separate a parent and a child. We treat a child, we treat a mother, or a parent or a caregiver. And her work is really a seminal piece of literature and research that focuses on the connection or the unit of the two. And then Daniel Stern's work was that which sort of took the next step in the evolution of the field of infant mental health, which connected the parent-child unit to the society in which it lived and thrived. And he spoke a lot about the importance of environment and the relationship that a parent and a child has with the society or the social environment in which it is living. And so that's creating a little bit of the foundation of the discipline of infant mental health. In 2004, Alicia Lieberman was one of the first to sort of start to talk about this idea of what is the legacy of slavery as it relates to the Afro-Caribbean family, as it relates to this understanding of infant mental health that tells us the attachment between the parent and the child is critical to the neurological and development of a child, and also the relationship of that parent-child unit to its society is really important. And what she talked about was the rupture of attachment, or that inability of a parent to attach to its infant as having significant historical wounds. So, as a psychologist who spent the last 20 plus years working in the mental health field in the Cayman Islands, I've always been very interested in what is the connection between the history of slavery in the Cayman Islands and mental health. As the wife of 30 years of a Black Caymanian and the mother of 2 adult Black male children, this has been particularly important to me. I think as a parent who walks through the world with a different lens than her child, you have to strive really hard to understand their experience. And so I'm going to give just a very brief history. We know that the transatlantic slave trade saw 12.5 million Africans taken from Africa. 2 million died during the Middle Passage, leaving 10.5 million to be distributed around the New World. 5.5 million of those enslaved Africans ended up in the Caribbean, 5 million to Brazil, and less than 500,000 to North America. And what is striking about that to me is that most of our understanding, scholarly and culturally, about the slave experience comes from North America. And yet that is where the least amount of enslaved Africans ended up. And what's particularly relevant, I think, is when I arrived in the Cayman Islands, there was a very clear narrative that I was met with back in the late 80s, and that was that we don't have racism, and we had slavery, but we treated them like family. And this has always been interesting to me. It's always been a conversation that I've wanted to participate in, a conversation that I was really eager to understand better. So what history tells us, and what the documents of history tell us, is that, I believe this is from the 1820s, it's a cargo registry. It shows an incoming cargo shipment into the Cayman Islands. It shows 12 barrels of rum, 20 barrels of provisions, and 6 Negroes. That doesn't sound like how our family travels. The trial of Long Celia is an incredible piece of history. And those of you that don't know the story of Long Celia, I encourage you to do so. I was introduced to the story of Long Celia by Dr. Frank Macfield. When I was a young clinician working for the Cayman Islands government, I was part of a national committee charged with investigating or understanding domestic violence, and eventually it turned into a group of people who would be the founding board members of the Cayman Islands Crisis Center. Now, the story itself, I think, gives us a glimpse into the life of slaves in the Cayman Islands, and it also speaks to some of the level of violence that they experienced. Long Celia had heard of impending emancipation in Jamaica. She started to talk about it. She spoke to her Caymanian slave owner wife, who then turned her in. A trial ensued. She was found guilty, and her punishment was 50 lashes on her bare body in a public setting. What's interesting is historians will tell you that at the time, 39 lashes was the maximum penalty, and so most historians will sort of speak to this event as an indication of the resistance of the Caymanian slave owner to this idea of slaves being freed. So Dr. Macfield was the minister at the time responsible for the ministry that was overseeing the crisis center. And he was the one that introduced me to this story. And so when we were getting ready to launch the crisis center, there was discussions about what we would name this house. And the government had purchased a house which this NGO would operate under the name of the Cayman Islands Crisis Center. And there were many of us who thought that Long Celia was an amazing name and a very appropriate name, given that it was the first recorded evidence of violence against women, that she was outspoken, she was speaking up for justice. So many of us felt that she was the perfect name to be representing the work of the Crisis Center. What was very interesting, troubling, was that there was a significant backlash against this idea. We had robust debates. There was a great deal of controversy, which surprised me. The general sort of idea was that that was in the past, we need to leave that alone, and we don't need to be bringing that back up. In the end, the Crisis Center House is named the Long Celia Memorial House, so those of us with loud voices refused to step down, and I think that's an important accomplishment. The next piece of history that sort of puts all this in context for me is the Cayman Slave Registry. I was able to secure a copy of this from the National Archives in the United Kingdom. It was issued on April 2nd, 1834. It lists approximately 120 slave owners and about 1,000 enslaved Caymanians. The enslaved Caymanians are listed by first name only. They range in age from 1 to 79. The registry was issued when word of compensation came about. So you know how government will pay you if they slice off a little piece of your land to widen a road? Well, when emancipation was coming and the Abolition Act was passed, there was an acknowledgement that slave owners would be paid compensation for their loss of property. And in order to receive the funds, they needed to register their slaves. When I look through the pages of this registry, I'm struck by the number of children that are listed. And this idea of children as property is something that doesn't sit well when we think of the narrative that we lived harmoniously. We have the example of apprenticeship, which was the 7-year period where slaves were to be compensated financially while we transitioned away from slave society to one of free persons. The Caymanian slaves weren't really interested in working for free. They were revolting a bit, according to history books. And so Cayman agreed to a deal, sort of forego apprenticeship and the separation between those who were newly freed became evident geographically in our country. The story of Andrew Malcolm, who was the first teacher to arrive in the Cayman Islands in 1839. He was sent by the Merco charity. He wrote letters back to his charity. He was very unhappy. He struggled with the mosquitoes. He struggled with much of the hardship of life we often hear about. But he was particularly troubled by his experience with what were no longer slave owners, but were white Caymanians who refused to have black children educated with their children. So what does any of this have to do with infant mental health? Well, a 2015 meta-analysis, which means they've taken a broad look at research and scholar across a wide area, found that racism is significantly connected to mental health. They looked at 293 studies in 21 countries, and this was the conclusion time and time again. We are spending millions on education. We're spending even more millions on mental health care. But we're not investing in the exploration of race and racism and the history of slavery, which research tells us is critically connected. In 2016, the National Child Trauma Stress Network came out with a position paper that implored countries and regions and governments to urgently understand this connection. In 2019, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is a very powerful institution, published a position paper on racism, citing a growing and no longer ignorable body of evidence to support the harm caused to children and infants by racism. I've heard no mention of racism as a risk factor for healthcare or mental health care in my 20+ years practicing in the Cayman Islands, and the Alex Panton Foundation, who did a very robust mental health survey several years ago. They were the first people, as far as I know, that were able to identify racism as a risk factor for suicidality amongst our youth. Okay, so what does this mean about the Afro-Caribbean family? We know that we can do all kinds of literature reviews and look at what we know, and what we continually come up with is that the Afro-Caribbean family has a multitude of risk factors. We know that there's risk factors for maternal stress. They did a study in France that included 1,100 parent-child dyads. They found that black women, more than any other race of women, showed higher levels of stress, and amongst black women, Afro-Caribbean women, or women who identified as from the wider Caribbean diaspora, were at greater risk than black women from Northern Africa or from Arab Africa. We also know that parental stress, there's a ton of research done even regionally by Dr. Sams Vaughan, who looks at the implications of stress and family outcomes. Again, we see lots of studies done on parenting in the Caribbean. We look at lots of studies that show sort of parenting practices. This tends to be the thing that is studied, is the type of parenting that the Afro-Caribbean family is most likely to utilize. There's lots of research that shows authoritarian or harsh corporal punishment as having really negative outcomes, depression, anxiety disorders. I'm going to skip that one. So, what is the adaptive functioning of the Afro-Caribbean parenting style, because we know that under stress, species adapt for survival. That's Darwinism. If the Afro-Caribbean parent has a blueprint of trauma in their DNA, what adaptations have occurred for the purpose of their survival? Dr. Joy DeGruy has done a ton of work on something she's coined post-traumatic slave syndrome, and she looks at what we often see and we think of as typical parenting in the Caribbean: harsh corporal punishment, less emotional warmness, less value on play, high value on performance. And she writes, if that attachment is broken, that attachment that we talked about as being fundamental, if that attachment is broken, then how does one parent fall in love with a child that they know is no longer going to be theirs? And she talks about the implications of this in mental health. And what's really interesting to me is there is a general consensus that the harsh parenting that you often see in the Afro-Caribbean region is a character default of the Afro-Caribbean person. It is something wrong with them. It is something that must be fixed. And what we failed to do in all of this research is to understand that that practice is perhaps an adaptive function that has allowed families to survive for generations. So there's been a plethora of money spent in the Caribbean region looking at parenting practices. A 2015 review of 23 Caribbean countries identified some key themes in parenting that emerge no matter where you go in the region. I just want to quickly share, I know I'm out of time, I'm not going to look over there. What has worked in the region? What they've found is that they have done multiple initiatives to fix parenting in the Afro-Caribbean community. And what they've found is that there are positive outcomes. But what most of the research in infant mental health leads me to believe is that we are missing the point. Our intervention and our money is being directed at teaching and fixing as opposed to understanding, holding, and healing. There was a seminal piece of research in the Caribbean called the Jamaica Stunted Child Study, and if you've never read it, I encourage you to do so. I have a copy of it. It started in 1991. They looked at children that were showing risks of stunting, which is a lack of growth, and they divided them into 3 categories. One group that was given nutritional supplementation, one group that was given the nutritional supplementation and nutritional training. So somebody went into the house and talked to mom and dad about nutrition and the importance. And another group that went in, gave the nutritional supplementation, but also demonstrated warmth and kindness and gave psychosocial support to the unit, the parent-child unit. And what they found was that by far the group that received the psychosocial stimulation, all groups, first of all, grew. So the nutritional supplementation was adequate for all children to move within what would have been a normative distribution of average height and weight. But what they found that was really compelling, what they've continued to study 20 years on, is that the cognitive and academic and employment outcomes of the group that received the psychosocial support have been statistically significant in every single marker point of measurement. And so how does this relate to the Cayman Islands, and where do we go from here? This paper was written not with this conference in mind. This paper was written even before what's happened in the last year and a half around the world. But I do think we need to start having open conversations. We need to be brave. We need to look at history accurately. And we need to understand what might be the needs of some of our most vulnerable families. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I should have a PowerPoint ready to go. maybe it'll catch up with me. My name is Linda Clark. I was born in Grand Cayman, and from secondary school I was educated in the UK, which may explain what some describe as my confused accent. I found out at the symposium yesterday I am a Nowherean. Yeah. After obtaining a BSc in economics, I returned home full-time and started a career in accounting, but not before I became a paddy dive master. More recently, I retrained, and in 2018, I earned a master's degree in marine environmental management. I am delighted to present today on behalf of Dr. Kelly Dunning, who is an expert in coral reef governance. She holds her PhD from MIT and has an MSc from Oxford University. Her lab is the Conservation Governance Lab, based at Auburn University School of Forestry and Wildlife in the US. Her research was published in February earlier this year by the peer-reviewed scientific journal Marine Policy. Dr. Dunning's paper and title of this presentation is Adaptive Governance, the Proposed Port Expansion in the Cayman Islands and its Impacts to Coral Reefs. Many thanks to Sabine Bailey for her assistance and Courtney Platt for the use of his photos. Dr. Dunning's on-island research was performed in late 2019 amidst the public debate leading up to the People's-initiated referendum on the Georgetown cruise berthing facility. Originally gazetted to be held on the 19th of December 2019, but which, as you may know, has now been postponed indefinitely. I also express my sincere thanks to Dr. Roy Bodden, the freedom fighter, who in the lead up to the referendum provided his expert opinion across several public platforms, in particular, posing his pointed question to the public, for whom are we developing? Increasingly, governments in the US and Caribbean are expanding shallow water ports adjacent to coral reefs. Because coral reefs are declining at an alarming rate worldwide, policymakers must manage project impacts to ensure they do not degrade ecosystems, which improve human well-being. Coral reef ecosystems provide us with fisheries, coastal protection, tourism, and cultural values. Preliminary evidence suggests port expansion projects are degrading reef ecosystem services, mainly by causing significant coral mortality due to erroneous underestimations of impacts. Despite these risks, the former administration of the Cayman government had been proceeding with a controversial port expansion project that subsequently escalated into a major environmental policy dispute. This remains ongoing. Socio-ecological crises and the contentious disputes that often accompany them trigger learning and knowledge generation and open up spaces for new management trajectories for ecosystems. This presentation provides an analysis of this policy dispute and asks how coral reef governance is changing as a result of the proposed port expansion in Cayman, and what can other countries considering similar projects learn from this case. This research uses a common social science concept of adaptive governance. Adaptive resource governance is defined as the conditions of ordered rule and collective decision-making enacted by connected individuals, organizations, agencies, and institutions at multiple scales. Natural resource governance that is adaptive and allows for learning is essential for governing complex socio-ecological systems during periods of change. Learning requires trustworthy information, and in the resource management field, is an essential process for developing and sustaining the ability of authorities, experts, interest groups, and the public to manage natural resources. Learning and information, especially on the scientific evidence of existing technology to restore coral reefs after infrastructure damage, is a central component of the Cayman environmental dispute. Our research question asks, how Caymanian governance is changing or adapting in the face of the ongoing port dispute, and what role learning plays in these changes. The data for this project came from several sources, including semi-structured interviews with 45 key informant stakeholders, including decision makers with the Cayman government, civil society members, and tourism industry professionals. Policy document data such as reports and websites, and the generation of ethnographic field notes during public meetings and field visits. The research design for this paper is a place-based case study, research that is locally generated to analyze detailed empirical data that may not be widely available. The dispute over the port expansion project began in 2013 when the government, led by the cabinet of the day, decided to build a cruise berthing facility in Georgetown Harbor. This would include 2 piers, dredging works, and land reclamation. These expanded facilities would replace the current model where 1.9 million cruise passengers per year pre-COVID are tendered by smaller boats from the cruise ships moored offshore. Government contacted a private company in 2015 to conduct a social and ecological impact assessment, an EIA, baseline conditions assessment, mitigation plan, and concept design. According to the EIA, the preferred dredge footprint, shown by the white hash lines on the right-hand image, if you can see over there, would impact 32 acres of marine habitat, including direct dredging of 10 acres of coral reef, which is shown in red, and an additional stretch within 200 meters of the dredge area in a high-impact zone shown in orange. This will be indirectly impacted by elevated turbidity and sedimentation during both construction and operation phases of the facility, and high coral mortality is likely. Popular coral reefs of cultural and historical importance, directly and indirectly impacted, include world-famous Eden Rock in Devil's Grotto and the historic Balboa shipwreck. In July of 2019, the government selected Verdant Isle Port Partners, VIPP, as the preferred bidder to the facility, to build the facility for an estimated $240 million US. The consortium consists of the 2 largest cruise companies in the world and several private engineering firms. Given the controversial nature of the project, VIPP responded to stakeholder concerns by proposing what it called a new and more environmentally friendly project, shown on the left-hand side. The new project has not had a technical plan published and hasn't undergone its own EIA. To increase public support for the new project, the government financed a public outreach campaign pledging an extensive coral reef restoration program, where environmental NGOs would replant 30 to 50% of the affected coral reefs, or regrow replacement coral in tanks. Verdant Isle Port Partners pledged to relocate 100% of threatened and endangered corals and conduct one-to-one mitigation, meaning for every coral lost, it would move or replant a coral. As shown here, some outreach material pledged 10-to-1 mitigation, with the variability in these numbers not explained due to the lack of published plans or a new EIA. This pro-project coalition was named Support Our Tourism and was led by prominent political leaders of the government, the Ministry of Tourism, VIPP, and the environmental NGO tentatively offered the project's mitigation role. Support Our Tourism framed several key benefits of the port project, including more jobs for Caymanians and more competitiveness in cruise tourism compared to other Caribbean islands. The network of stakeholders opposed to the project included elected members of the then Legislative Assembly, Caymanian civil society, and NGOs, including the National Trust of the Cayman Islands, which has a statutory authority to conserve the environment. A civil society organization formed Cruise Port Referendum Cayman, or CPR Cayman, leading public outreach campaigns to emphasize several risks of the port project, including 1, the lack of an EIA for the new project and its technical plans had not been provided to the public, and 2, the major scientific uncertainty surrounding the feasibility of coral relocation and replanting, especially at the scale being proposed for project mitigation. Cayman has strong domestic and international policy frameworks in place to protect coral reefs, protections that could be violated by the project. For example, the 2001 Environment Charter with the UK and Section 18 of the 2009 Cayman Constitution, Protection of the Environment. The project directly threatens 2 internationally recognized critically endangered coral species, their common names elkhorn coral and staghorn coral, both pictured here, thanks to Courtney Platt. Under the National Conservation Law, the EIA was reviewed by the government's own Environmental Assessment Board, which found the risks to the economically and ecologically important coral reefs had been underestimated, and the EIA had overestimated the ability to perform coral mitigation. They estimated a direct loss of 15 acres of coral habitat, not 10 acres, and lethal sedimentation could reach 600 meters from the dredge zone, not the 200 meters reported in the EIA. Due to concerns raised by government's own review, civil society organized a volunteer-led campaign to petition Cabinet, which involved physically collecting signatures of 25% of the Cayman electorate to trigger a people's-initiated referendum, the first in the Cayman Islands and any UK overseas territory in the history of the UK overseas territories. This was allowed under Section 70 of the Constitution. After the over 5,000 signatures were individually verified by the Elections Office, Cabinet set a referendum date in 2018, 6 days before Christmas, asking voters to vote yes in favor of the project or no against the project. Given the lack of precedents for the vote, there were no laws or regulations in place for how the process would unfold. The government determined that the referendum would need 50% plus 1 of all registered voters, not voter turnout on the day, to vote no for it to pass. The government also determined that of the 21,200 registered voters, any no-show would be considered a yes vote in favor of the project. Due to the perceived gamemanship of the referendum process, 2 legal challenges against the referendum were upheld by the courts, delaying the vote. This research finds evidence from the port dispute that resource governance in Cayman is changing in 4 ways, all of which can serve as lessons to other places considering similar projects. First, Cayman institutions are being significantly changed by both pro- and anti-port stakeholders. Despite aggressive domestic and international policy commitments to reef protection and long-established marine park networks, 15 acres of coral reef is expected to be destroyed by direct dredging. Second, institutional changes have increased space for private companies and consultants to influence Cayman decision-making, contested by civil society. Third, non-state actors such as civil society, for example, CPR Cayman, and the private sector, i.e. the global cruise industry, are significantly shaping public discourse and having major impacts on decision-making. Fourth, the rise of the private sector in decision-making has led civil society to trigger a participative democracy, i.e. the first ever people's-initiated referendum, in ways never before seen in the Cayman context. An important lesson to learn is that while civil society successfully triggered a referendum on the project, there has been an erosion of Caymanian institutions by the private sector. Countries with a weaker civil society may not be capable of contesting similar major environmental projects. While adaptive governance is occurring in Cayman, important questions are raised for the future over whether civil society or large, multinational, for-profit corporations should set the policy agenda. In this case, learning is critical. Disagreements between the scale and extent of the proposed damage, the importance of a revised EIA, and the capacity to restore damaged corals as promised have still to be resolved. Our recommendations are for a robust, impartial EIA for any revised port projects, fair rules for the referendum if and when it occurs that are not gamed to achieve a particular outcome, that government follow domestic and international laws and policies around coral reef conservation, and that government allow a major decision-making role for Cayman's formal environmental institutions such as the Environmental Assessment Board. Thank you so much for listening. I'd now be happy to take any questions, or I can pass them on to Dr. Dunning, or we might be ready to move on. Okay, all right. Please see me afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I want to pay tribute to Dr. Bodden because his work called for tremendous discipline over the years. When I saw this advertisement, I felt that I could throw a spanner into the intellectual works. Yes, intellectual, by dealing with something that was more down to earth. That is the Cayman Sir Anthony Fisher's failed initiative, Caribbean Dairies Farm. I was challenged, and I didn't have any problem with finding that it intersects with the continuing evolution of the Caymanian economy, the nature of small island states, education, Caymanian history, and the Cayman Islands education system. But for these few minutes, you are going to be the intellectuals. I'm going to throw some things out about the dairy, and you can make the intersections. I think what I've heard in the last few hours has been so intense, and I think we need to, as I said, bring it down to earth again, and you can make the connections. When I first came to Cayman, I spent a lot of time in the library and trying to find out a lot more about the island. And quickly discovered that there were substantial holes in the history of Cayman, from what I could find out. And I focused on two areas of research. One, my ongoing one, CGH Goring, and this one, Caribbean Dairy Farm. Why this one? Well, a lot of my working life has been juggling education with dairy farming. And I was fascinated as to why someone would want to start a dairy farm in Grand Cayman, given the geological situation and a number of other challenges. Anyway, I'm going to look at two backgrounds. First, put it in context. One, Anthony Fisher, the driving force behind the initiative, who was also the driving force behind mariculture, the Cayman, I've forgotten the current name for the turtle farm. Turtle Center. And that tells me that the battles he fought then are still being fought now with those persons who do not want you to take full advantage of the fact that you can harvest turtles and still maintain the turtle population. Anyway, let's deal with the dairy business. And this gentleman who was so bold as to spend his money in this initiative. Now, Anthony Fisher, Sir Anthony Fisher, well, he died in 1988. Sir Anthony Fisher, I'm going to give you two contrasting views. Some of you may have heard of Enoch Powell in the 70s, and it was argued in one article that there were 3 millionaires who had agreed to finance and to make Mr. Powell's views more widely held. This was an article, part of it was entitled, "Who Are the Racialists?" And the argument put forward was that the most generous of these millionaires was Mr. Anthony Fisher, who had made several million pounds for himself by building up and selling Buxter chickens. Now, he'd been to the US, he'd seen how you could mass produce chickens, lower the price of that meat, so that the common man could have more of that kind of protein. He wasn't all bad, just not racialist. But anyhow, this man argued, this article argued, that Mr. Fisher, like Mr. Sandys, is an expert in tax avoidance and has a number of interests in the Cayman Islands. Now, it seems to me that there's another view of Sir Anthony Fisher, and that comes out because not only was he interested in bringing and making available cheaper chicken to the English, but he came to the Cayman Islands and recognized that the cost of milk was 4 times what it was in Britain. And he had this brilliant idea that, of course, he wasn't alone in it. The Charles Hutchins, the Director of Agriculture at the time, encouraged him to believe that you could pulverize the rock and then you could make that fertile land to grow grass and so on. So this gentleman, who was more interested at the beginning in starting the turtle farm, tremendous ideas, tremendous potential, believed he could also start a dairy farm. And he used quite a bit of his wealth with input from some of his friends who became shareholders to start Caribbean Farms Limited. One of his sons was enthused and joined him in the idea, and I just quote a little bit. While on Grand Cayman, Anthony had an investment idea of his own, observing that the island's milk supplies were imported and that milk was consequently sold at 4 times the price in England. He began to speculate as to whether a dairy herd could be maintained on the island. His son said that the idea of an overseas business venture in a warm and beautiful place, which was also a tax haven, proved irresistible. Dad loved snorkeling, and I was a trained diver, which all added to the appeal of the place. Fortunately, he had a younger son, Mike, and Mike summed it up very briefly. Why not invest in Antarctica? There are no taxes there, and the grass wouldn't grow either. Well, there you have it. 2 divergent views in the family. I'm skipping quite a bit. You must remember that this was in the late 1960s, and the oil embargo, I think, was around 1972. And it was in this period that the dairy was started. There were a number of problems, as you would have foreseen, and I'm going to just spend a minute or two on those. But before I do that, I'll mention that at the end of it, he had lost quite a bit of money on both ventures. He became depressed, and he also lost money on another business venture called Flair Plastics, but that one was based in Britain. He was not a stupid man. In fact, he was involved in the startup of 150 think tanks around the world. He had this ambition also of establishing think tanks, intellectual activity, think tanks around the world. And he was involved in approximately 150 of those. So he's not a stupid man. You can judge him when I finish, or when you yourself do a bit more research. Let me briefly deal with a little bit of the local background. 1891, there was a reference that there's good pasturage, principally guinea grass, and horses, cattle, pigs, poultry, etc., are reared in sufficient numbers to meet the demand of the local population of about 4,000 at that time on Grand Cayman. In 1937, Edwards, in his agricultural survey, has little to say about animal husbandry, but he had a general comment that I think is instructive. Quote, as a general standard of agriculture is at present very low, and as returns will be considerably increased without capital expenditure if a sound agricultural policy was followed and judicious agricultural practices adopted, every effort should tend towards improving the agricultural education of the population. And I think that was a key word then, and it's still a key word now, education. Briefly, from one of the colonial reports, agriculture in the Cayman Islands is, as elsewhere, the product of geologic, climatic, economic, and cultural conditions. On the whole, these are not favorable in the Cayman Islands for sustained, intensive agricultural production. But nevertheless, there's a moderate potential. Historically, there have been periods when the island was self-sufficient in coarse food crops, meats, and certain fruits, and there have even been periods when surpluses have been exported. The productive periods occurred between World War I and World War II at intervals when able-bodied men could find no other employment. In 1968, then, Caribbean Farms was started by Anthony and Mark Fisher in Bodden Town near Peace Bay Pond. The herd size, number of animals, ranged initially from 50 cows to about 100 in 1973, mainly Brown Swiss and Holstein, for those of you who may know a little bit about coology. These were flown in from the US and the UK. According to the newspaper report in the 1969, the dairy project on the way was to produce enough fresh milk daily to supply some of the need of Grand Cayman, and this is the aim of the new enterprise. 60 of the 200 acres being leased had already been cleared, grass suitable for grazing will be planted, and it's estimated that 15 milk cows will arrive via Jamaica, and that the herd will be increased to 100 and should produce a minimum approximately of 300 gallons of milk daily. Well, what about the setup? So a modern herringbone milking unit, a refrigerated tank, and a pasteurizer would be installed, and after pasteurization, the milk would be cartoned and sold locally. Now, sounds to me like that's a bit of money that was invested. Stainless steel equipment, importation of animals, and they wouldn't just be any old animals. So there would have been cows that would have a certain pedigree in terms of milk production. There's another record that says that by 1970, Caribbean Farms had increased production to 1,100 gallons of milk per week and 759 gallons of other beverages during 1970. And there's an interesting note. The dairy is producing other beverages. This is not unusual, but it does seem to indicate that they quickly recognized that they had to broaden the base of their products if they were to survive. The range of products included fresh pasteurized homogenized milk, half and half, chocolate, eggnog, and banana milk. And Sunlight Drinks, that was the brand name, I think. There was orange, there was fruit punch, there was lemon, and Festival Fiesta, made from imported fruit and powder. So, from its inception in 1968, you can say we are making progress. Deliveries were made as far as West Bay. There were plans to produce butter, cheese, and yogurt, but this never materialized. By 1973 or thereabouts, the farm was sold to Caledonian Farms, and that was the end of Caribbean Dairy Farms. The actual production of milk survived for a few more years at Caledonian Farms, and then that was closed. You could ask yourself, well, why was it not a success? And I'm not going to go into that. I'll just simply say that fingers were pointed at the fact that imported milk was being brought in, that there was a startup making bottled drinks around the same, another startup, that was not the first one, around the same time, that the challenges were too great. You know, I could ask you, for example, if a dairy cow, which in hot weather can drink 20 gallons of water, needs about 20 gallons of water per day, if a dairy cow does not get enough water, can you tell me what happens? You could have evaporated milk coming from the cow. Worse than that, it could be powdered milk. All right, I can go on and on, but I think I'm going to stop by saying that I was also moved towards this study because in the 1960s, in another Caribbean island, a dairy was also started. And involved in that project, the shareholders would have been out of Britain, out of New Zealand, the government of the island, some private enterprise. And that synergy seemed to have worked to have allowed that dairy to survive to this day. In Cayman, it was, there wasn't any local input as far as I can see, apart from persons working in the dairy. There wasn't any government assistance apart from the initial idea, as far as I can see. And the challenges, although great, I think could have been overcome. I don't know if there are any questions. I have pages and pages more, but I think that sums it up. I don't want the second bell on me. Okay.
I'm going to see if I can set up my own timer. Here we go. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, much like Mr. Jackson, I find myself feeling somewhat unequal at this event because unlike the other esteemed speakers, I am neither an academic nor a scholar, and I am nowhere near as familiar as my fellow speakers with Roy Bodden's works. Indeed, I tried to find his books in the local law school library, but there were none available. I tried to find his books in the main public library, but they were all checked out. And although I do see the full catalogue is available to purchase in the lobby if you speak to Lee, that tells me at least two things. One, that his books are very popular. Two, he has a very clever marketing strategy. But I'm very pleased to speak to you in a personal capacity here today, as someone who appreciates very strongly Roy Bodden's contribution to political thinking in Cayman. We fulfilled our domestic election observation mission a few weeks ago when we completed our terms of reference and published our report. So today I would like to pick out and build on some of the ideas contained in our report, which I believe are in harmony with some of Roy Bodden's themes. I should point out that while we were drafting our report, we spoke to as many people as we could, and I'm very grateful to Roy Bodden for his insightful and helpful interview. However, I've not had the chance to catch up with him since the report was published, so I have no idea whether he agreed or disagreed with our analysis, but I do hope he will recognize some of his themes. Now, please understand that I am an independent and impartial observer, so I make no criticisms of anyone past or present, and please do not go looking for any coded messages. There are none. Today, we're here to think intellectually about public life in Cayman in the future. Not just the next election, but the one after that, and the one after that. I'm going to talk about two concepts today, but you may breathe a sigh of relief. They are not slavery and they're not colonialism. I'm going to talk, one, about the future of the party system in Cayman, and two, the creation of a political ombudsman or electoral commission. On topic one, the party system. To set the terms for this discussion, I refer to Roy Bodden's comparison of political teams and political parties in Cayman. I'll begin with a quote from Roy Bodden on election night. He said, I won't do an impression, I'll just read it plain. The absence of a party inconveniences, if not negatively affects, the members opposite. If you're in a formal party and you lose in an important constituency, the party is there to make sure that from when the election results are proclaimed, you are working to regain that seat for the next election. But what happens to you in the Cayman situation, if you lose, there is no machinery to sustain you. If you are young and want to continue in public life, you just have a flat drop. You are on your own because there is no party machinery or district organization to make sure you are still active in the constituency. You have the party machinery behind you, so you do not need to fall on your own finances. I think that is a very insightful and perhaps characteristically insightful observation, because the Constitution refers to the role of political parties. The Elections Act, sections 22 to 27, set out the procedure for registering a political party, but there are no real legal incentives for candidates to form political parties. Ideally, I think a healthy, fair, and balanced system would have multiple parties that are based around a common, stable, permanent set of principles, not around personalities, but with space for independent and non-affiliated candidates to make the process more competitive and diverse. I think this explains why many consider, including Roy Bodden, why political behavior in Cayman seems a little bit unstable from time to time. An elector may find themselves supporting one candidate in an election under a specific color and platform, but the next time find themselves supporting the same candidate under a different banner with a completely different platform. To take an example from the UK, one MP rose through the ranks of the Labour Party and was considered a possible contender for the next leadership. He left the party over a disagreement and founded a new party called Change UK. After poor results, he left Change UK and became an independent. After a short time as an independent, he joined the Liberal Democrat Party. Now, how did the voters feel about this? Apparently, shortchanged, because he lost his seat at the earliest opportunity. Yesterday, I think we were all quite shocked to see Professor Mubarak's comparison of Cayman's mangroves in the 1970s and today. I certainly, if you were here, heard a very loud, dramatic gasp from the audience. So environmental issues are very, very important to Cayman. And there are several small groups and different interest groups who raise concerns from time to time. We would call them pressure groups or protest groups, often in the UK. But there doesn't appear to be a clear political directorate based on environmental principles. That is not to say that candidates that have previously stood have no policies on the environment or anything like that, not at all. But what I'm talking about is a package and an identity that is founded on environmental principles, as an example. It would seem to me that the runway is clear for a group of candidates to come together at the next election or the one after and establish some kind of, let's say, Cayman Green Party or Environmentalist Party or Ecology Party with a clear program of protecting the wetlands, investment in solar infrastructure, more public transport, and so on. If a candidate stands for that party, the electorate would immediately understand what they are to expect, and they can also punish a candidate if they stray too far from the principles, not just individual policies, on which they were elected. So to go back to Roy Bodden's quote, stable political parties can have very positive effects on public life and can be used as a tool to invest in the future of public life in Cayman. First, knowledge. Ask any first-time or even experienced candidate, and they will tell you that they had no idea when they first started how much work and how much they had to learn in the campaign. It is overwhelming, it is exhausting, it is relentless. I'm sure Mr. Mario Ebanks would attest to that fact, as he spoke earlier. Yes, thank you. So organizations that endure from election to election build up a kind of collective expertise and knowledge which they can pass on to newer candidates. This seems to me to be a very good start when it comes to engaging young and talented Caymanians in public life. Equally, it is important to retain talent. I saw many candidates, many of them quite young, who performed very well and clearly have a lot to contribute in ideas and energy to public life. It would be a huge loss to the country if these candidates drifted away because there was no machinery to sustain them and invest time and energy into developing them as candidates and political thinkers. On top of that, having a youth wing for a party is an excellent way to involve young Caymanians and, crucially, make sure that they are listened to within a party, even if they have not yet reached the age where they can vote. Compare this also with the participation of women. Something like 20% of the candidates in the last election were women. So I think parties have a role and a responsibility to invest in and promote female candidates, to nurture them for the future. And there are many ways of doing this. For example, in France and many European jurisdictions, they have a proportional list system, and their parties are legally obliged to achieve gender parity. That means their list will typically go male, female, male, female, male, female, or the other way around. I have my timer at 10 minutes. 2 thumbs up there, ladies and gentlemen, so we've got 10 more minutes. I won't take you that long. As Henry VIII once said to his wives, I won't keep you for too long. In the UK, one party implemented a policy called all women shortlists. This meant that they identified seats where they thought they would win comfortably and said, we are only accepting applications to stand in this district from women. And then it was up to the members of that district to choose from a shortlist of all female candidates. Thus, within the limits of the whims of the electorate, it stacked the deck, if you like, in favour of having a female MP elected. Furthermore, a party exists to generate as much political capital as it can. They can act as an early warning system So that means when a party analyzes the results after an election, the strategists can identify areas where they are strong and where they are weak. Consider, if a candidate is returned with a very narrow majority, for example, they know that when the next election rolls around, they need to put more resources into campaigning in that area, or possibly that the candidate themselves is not performing as well as they could be. The result is that weaker candidates may be replaced by stronger ones, typically opening the door to young or female candidates. You may notice that this is also one of the benefits of term limits, but has the advantage of being more flexible. I mentioned earlier that there are few legal incentives to establish a party, making it more expedient to fly flags of convenience in some cases. And we heard many candidates raise concerns about campaign and political financing. I suggest that multiple established political parties could be one of the tools used to make campaign finance more transparent and fair. Because with greater rights and incentives, we can also set out responsibilities for parties. And that brings me to my second theme, the Electoral Commission. In our observation, we suggested creating a body that was capable as acting as a political referee. We referred to it as a political ombudsman, but it could just as well be called an Electoral Commission. And this body would be separate from the Elections Office. An Electoral Commission, in my view, would be an independent and impartial body with a permanent presence to monitor the political and electoral process all the time, not just at election time. Because many candidates explained that most political money exchanges hands well before the regulated period of the campaign. We thought, can we just extend the regulated period? Not really, for two reasons. One, it would not solve the problem, it would just move it. And two, it would cause all sorts of complications over deadlines that would probably require constitutional change. During an election, I think the Commission could act as a political referee and be able to adjudicate fairly and impartially on complaints and disputes, not just between candidates and the Elections Office, but also between candidates accusing each other of wrongdoing. Before an election, I see its mission as developing guidelines and providing interpretations of the elections law in a way that is easy for candidates to understand and implement. This was another point that was raised to us time and time again. It would approach matters in a way that is politically realistic and more intuitive than legislation that needs regular, somewhat drawn-out amendment processes. In particular, media organizations and elections campaigns said to us that they were worried about putting themselves on the wrong side of the Elections Act through a lack of clarity and understanding about what was allowed or not allowed. It would also be able to explain the distinction between must responsibilities and should responsibilities. Between elections, an electoral commission could be continuously engaged in making recommendations to electoral law and regulating political financing. What I'm saying here is you do not need to rely on me coming back in 4 years' time to conduct another observation. Parties, campaigners, and other relevant groups would also be able to report, and in some cases be obliged to report, the donations and the loans that they've received, what they spent on the campaign after an election, and then also an annual reporting system for their accounts. And I've hit the 15 minutes, yet no bell, but I will wrap up. So, in conclusion, I'd once again like to pay tribute to Roy Bodden for his contribution to political thinking in Cayman. I hope that I am reasonably accurate in my understanding of his analysis of the party system in Cayman. And finally, I hope that some of the ideas I have put forward today, both on the party system and the role of an electoral commission, provide useful material that will advance thinking about public life in Cayman in the spirit of Roy Bodden's public intellectualism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Could we put our hands together one more time for all of our panelists? And my apologies that we're not able to accommodate questions. Unfortunately, we're running way behind in terms of time, and we want to welcome our final speaker in another 2 minutes. But these wonderful people are at your disposal, and that's the advantage if you were here with us at the Hartwell Theatre. For those of you who are online, anyone who wants an opportunity to speak with them will have an opportunity to do so if you are here at the Hartwell Theatre. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite our panel to kindly take your seats within the audience so that we can invite our public intellectual to speak with us for the final few minutes of the symposium. Again, thank you very much, not just to you, but to all of our presenters today. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely my distinct pleasure at this time to welcome to the podium the man for whom we're here today, Mr. J.A. Roy Bodden, a former member of the Legislative Assembly, now Parliament, Minister for Education, former Minister for Education, Human Resources and Culture, President Emeritus of the UCCI, an educator, cultural historian, and author, and dare I say, Cayman's public intellectual. He's coming now to speak with us on the topic, the role of the public intellectuals in the Cayman Islands. Applause, please.
What can I say? I am humbled, overwhelmed, almost speechless, and that's a condition that has not been a characteristic of mine. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. You know, when I set out to write, I had no idea how my works would be received. A true artist, I really hoped it would have brought success, it would have been accepted, digested by people, talked about. But I wasn't sure. And so in conversations with my wife, I would sometimes say, well, I hope that it is received by a wide audience, but if it's not, I won't be disappointed because I am informed and entertained by my own writings. So I thank you kindly for paying me that homage. Sometimes I think I don't even deserve it. Anyway, I shall be eternally grateful to you and also to the Cultural Foundation for this venue and these arrangements, and to my good friend, Dr. Livingston Smith, whose idea this was when we were colleagues at the University College. It has certainly not been an easy journey. Today I'm going to be like the pastor who spent the weekend preparing a great sermon. When he came to church on Sunday, saw the audience, got the synergy, and decided to shed the sermon. So I'm going to speak sometimes extemporaneously and sometimes from my notes, but always from the heart. It has not been an easy journey because in a society where persons who are viewed and labeled as being outside of the establishment, when they try to inform and elevate, their efforts are regarded as disturbing the status quo, troublemaker. I've been branded all those things of the whole encyclopedia. And in this particular case, the situation is further compounded by another circumstance. And I want to put this as delicately as I can, but some things cannot be avoided. People ask me, why wasn't this held at the University College, where students could have access to the presentations as they were interested? Well, this morning in her presentation, my good friend, the Honorable Madam Speaker, as I call her, she gave the answer. It wasn't held at the University College because the president of the University College refused to have the ceremony there. The president being one of those who have afforded themselves an unwarranted level of superiority no one should have in another man's country. A supercilious attitude permeates every level of activity. Now you answer this question and you will see the difficulty of a public intellectual in a society like the Cayman Islands. I was the president of the University College for 9 years, the person who rescued it from the morass in which a former imported president left it. And now, upon my departure, the board was so impressed that they gave me the title of President Emeritus. And yet, I could not hold a function like this. A function like this to uplift, elevate the minds of Caymanians? What kind of society is this? So, that, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, gives you the challenge that public intellectuals are up against. And I'm not the only one that suffered these things. Probably before me there were people like Dr. Frank McField, all that. But anyway, let me get back to my sermon. I want to define first what is meant by a public intellectual, and I was going to give you a brief history of how public intellectuals came into being, but I'll forego that in the interest of time. And then finally, I want to discuss public intellectuals and their connection with what some people call the common good. That is, those things that interest us all and to the benefit of the whole society. Now, I've had the good fortune of growing up in the old Cayman and spending all of my life to this point to the new Cayman. The old Cayman had a spirit of community. I am my brother's keeper. We were all in the village, all in the hamlet. Everyone was concerned about whether such and such a person had a meal today or how their welfare was. Now, this is a new Cayman, where it seems every man is for himself, and God, when they admit he exists, is for us all. So, I saw these changes, and I began to say to myself, the society needs a conscience, needs someone to remind them, someone to set these things down. So I gave myself an appointment, a self-appointed commentator, because I don't want to say I'm an intellectual, because I don't want people to think that I'm snobbish or I'm arrogant. So I decided, particularly after reading some of my famous historical characters, to take up this vocation. Lucian of Samosata, one of my favorites, says that Persons who offer these kinds of comments, who take up this position, must be fearless, a friend of free expression and to truth, giving nothing to hatred or to friendship, sparing no one, showing neither pity nor shame nor obsequiousness, an impartial judge, independent, not reckoning what this or that man will think, but writing down the facts. Further, it's important for this person to be bold in opening up the Caymanian society to an uncompromising post-mortem, which is immune from the put-down that the detractors will level. So, who then is a public intellectual? According to Detch, writing in 2012, public intellectuals are persons who exert a large influence in the contemporary society of their country of origin through their thought, writing, and speaking. And another authority, Amitai Etzioni, famous sociologist, opines, he says that public intellectuals opines on a wide variety of issues. They're generalists rather than specialists, and they concern themselves with matters of interest to the public at large, what I call concern themselves with matters which fall under the rubric of the common good. And then I went to Wikipedia, and this is the one that I like because it's comprehensive. The term public intellectual describes the intellectual who participates in the public affairs discourse of the society in which they live. In addition to their academic career, regardless of the academic field or the professional expertise, the public intellectual raises and responds to the normative problems of the society, and as such is expected to be an impartial critic who rises above the partial preoccupation of one's own profession and engages with global issues of truth, judgment, and taste of the time. So, from those definitions, I want to take you now to, in the interest of time, the work of a public intellectual. It shouldn't surprise us that the public intellectual will have to be first an astute observer of the society. That is what I set out to do. I was always motivated by this question: what is in the best interest of the majority of people in the Cayman Islands? What are some of the things that we hold in common? What are the values and the morals that we should seek to pursue to ensure that we develop a society which has the best interest of everyone at heart? And in my paper, I talk about the common good. The common good. The common good is also a phenomenon which other intellectuals have latched onto. And in 2018, Robert Reich published a book called The Common Good. According to Reich, the common good consists of shared values about what we owe one another as citizens who are bound together in the same society. The norms we voluntarily abide by and the ideals we seek to achieve. It recognizes that we are all in this together. And if there is no common good, there is no society. So something that would be a common good in Caymanian society would be the preservation of the environment, for example. I suggest to you that in a small developing society like the Cayman Islands, the public intellectual may be the only impartial judge as to what is the common good. And so we need people who are going to prick our consciences, stir us up, remind us, show us, teach us where we are going wrong. Albert Einstein said that the world is a dangerous place, not because of people who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. Another of my favorite characters from history is Edmund Burke. Here's what Edmund Burke said: "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for men of goodwill to do nothing." Of course, when he says men, he means men and women of goodwill to do nothing. So, if we come back to the Cayman Islands now, there is a desire and a need for public intellectuals. All of the topics I've listened to, all of the speakers have shared a common thread, which brings us to the fact that we should be concerned about where we are going, about the future. And I'll say this: having been there, I am not one of those persons who are willing and would voluntarily give up all of the decision-making to political directorates. So public intellectuals, one of their main responsibilities is to bring to the fore issues that we should be concerned about. But in the Cayman Islands, this is difficult because we live in a society where persons who draw on their intellectual insight and write and speak and elevate and inform the society are regarded as pariahs, troublemakers, and persons who should be gotten rid of. That is because we are not an intellectual society. The Cayman Islands is not an intellectual society. It is not a society where we have developed a sense of propriety and respect for those people who excel in knowledge and who participate in what I call a shared intellect, but rather we are a society where the greatest value is placed on socioeconomic status, caste, and color. And by its very nature, this society is skewed against those people whose writings promote scholarship, food for thought, and direction. In Cayman, where one lives is far more important than one's education or publicly expressed concerns for the common good. There is far too little appreciation for those who display a moral, I might even say an ascetic commitment to ideas, including cultural and spiritual ideas which serve to uplift the society. And the public intellectual, except for a precious few, is not known or appreciated in these Cayman Islands. In the Cayman Islands, the public intellectual's promotion of the common good and his or her willingness for open sharing is often met by ad hominem criticisms of the person. And rather than a critique of the idea and the efficacy of those ideas, the author of the ideas are traced and put down. So instead of lighting a candle, what happens is that they curse the darkness and curse those who exerted the effort to stimulate discussions. Too many people hide behind anonymity, especially in the age of social media, and they make unflattering and unsavory comments about the authors of ideas. Rather than exploring the idea for the worth it has, they try to find the author and chase that person and intimidate them into silence so that they or persons like them may have their way. The highway is littered with the tombstones of Caymanian people who tried to improve the society but was crushed by an establishment which is selfish, which is arrogant, and which is self-serving and corrupt. And so I put it to you this question: what is the future of intellectualism and public intellectuals in Cayman? What is the future of those who offer ideas which are different from what the establishment believes? What is the future of the young people who are deprived opportunities to participate in the society? What is the future of young people who are denied opportunities to make a positive contribution? What kind of society are we living in? And so for the public intellectual, according to my experience, you have to be a special type of person, immune from put downs, not easily discouraged, and prepared to make your own way in the face of all the storms and obstacles that will be placed in your path. Wisdom born of experience leads me to tell you, my beloved audience, that in Caymanian society, anyone who raises and responds to normative problems must expect to be pilloried and castigated, often by those who are nameless and faceless. Whether this signifies that these people have a lack of knowledge and capabilities, or whether it means that they're ignorant and blinded by their wealth and social status, and believe that this wealth and social status trumps intellectual achievement and the promotion of the common good. I'm not sure, and probably that is a question best left to a future symposium to answer. What I can tell you is that the journey is not easy, but it is a pleasure for me, and I am humbled by the respect that you have given. I hope that out of this symposium, many more J.A. Roy Boddens come, because I know that you are out there. And I would love to see us in Caymanian society now that we have everything else, now that we have all the wealth in the world and the wealthiest man in the world overdeveloping us. I would hope that we have a little time left to create an intellectual experience, and we can pause to appreciate what we had. Because if a stop is not put to this madness, soon they will concrete every square inch of these islands and tear down every mangrove. So I thank you kindly. I hope that God allows me time to continue writing, because that is my role. Thank you.
I have always admired Bodden's writings as authorities on a number of subjects, and we've established that over the last 2 days. However, I must admit that my regard for his works has grown tremendously, because I did not realize until this symposium the wide range of fields and disciplines that his writing impacts. And so I found it ironic just now when he said thank you. And I thought to myself, oh no, thank you, Mr. Bodden. And speaking of thanks, my task today, my final task, is to thank those who have made this event what it is. So a special thanks to the Cayman National Cultural Foundation for hosting this important event in collaboration with the Committee for the Promotion of Research and Cayman Scholarship. To all of our presenters, please know that we appreciate your taking the time to join us to discuss these important issues that impact the Cayman Islands and indeed our world. Special thanks to our sponsor, Radio Cayman, for helping us to promote this event, and to the team at GIS for providing the opportunity for this symposium to be viewed online. Thanks to our online viewers and to our Hartquail Theatre attendees. You have been a fabulous audience. Thank you. And though I've already said it, a very special thank you to Mr. Roy Bodden for the significant contributions that you have made to the Cayman Islands as an academic and scholar, as an artist, educator, and author. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Stephanie Fullerton Cooper, and it is my pleasure, if I might borrow the theater expressions, now that all of our presenters have brought down the house. It is my task to close that final curtain. May God bless you all as you travel safely home or to your various places, and may God bless these, our Cayman Islands. Thank you.